Hello all. So in this session I am going to discuss the economic questions which were asked in the UPSC mains 2024. So before we start the discussion, let me just tell you that the questions which has been asked, they were the level of questions was quite moderate to easy level, and anyone who has read thoroughly will be able to handle the questions, except one question. All the questions you will be able to easily write it. And there were 8 questions on economy. To start with, the first question was, see, before writing, here I am going to discuss you not the exact point, but rather how to approach the question, on what things you need to focus more while you are writing the answer to that questions, and what you should just discuss shortly. So here we will be discussing in depth how you should approach that question. So the first question is, examine the pattern and trend of public expenditure on social services in the post-reforms period in India. To what extent this has been in consonance with achieving the objectives of inclusive growth. So there are 2 parts to the question. Examine the pattern and trend of public expenditure on social services in the post-reforms. A little bit this is not a question which everyone can expect. थोड़ा सा हटके है, different है, a little bit different. And I understand that these kind of questions are not exactly taught in the classes also, but students with their knowledge, with their readings, they should be able to handle this kind of questions. So let us understand that how we need to approach it. First thing is that you should know that what is the present fact. I have told in the class also that first, how can you approach is that you can define that what are social services. In the economic survey, they have defined that what includes social services. So you can start with that. As per the economic survey, social services are defined as expenditure on health, education, sports, art and culture, welfare, housing. All these comes under social services. And you can just write, give a reference that as per economic survey, social services are defined as like this. Now you have to discuss the pattern and trend of public expenditure on social services. So what you should have in mind is that, see, once we implement it, and this is talking about the reforms, means 1991 LPG reforms, means 1991 LPG reforms. So when we implemented LPG reforms, the economic growth, before that the growth was around 4-5%. Post reforms, the growth slightly started increasing. So we increased the expenditure on social services, but the expenditure did not increase immediately, right? So slowly it started increasing, because when government's budgetary resources increased, government got more resources, and then they are able to expend more on social services. So as of today, if you'll talk about 2023-24, you see total expenditure is on social services 7.7%. This is the economic survey data of 2023-24. So education 2.7%, health 1.9%, and others are 3.1%. So total 7.7% expenditure right now. When we implemented the LPG reforms, 1992-1991, at that time it was 2.5%. So in the 90s, expenditure on social services was around 2.5%. In the 2000 decade, growth further increased. So when growth increased, we started spending more on social services. So in 90s decade, it was 2.5%. In 2000 decade, it moved to around 5 to 5.5%. And now in the 2020 decade, it has moved to around 7.5 to 7.7%. So it has increased from 1991, 2004 and 2024. If you'll see the trend, 2.5%, 5%, and approximately 7.5%. So this has been the trend on expenditure on social services. And why it has been possible? Because government, our economic growth increased in the post-reforms period. So you'll have to write these things. So first you can define that what includes social services. Then you can start, you will give a brief background of the economic reforms of LPG, and then you'll write this trend. See, the question talks about, so pattern and trend you will discuss, and you can also discuss about future, some schemes which government implemented, for example, in every decade, let's say 2000 to decade, National Rural Health Mission or Sarv Shiksha Abhiyan, then 2010 to 20 decade, Right to Educational National Health Mission, and then 2024. So, in every phase, you can write one or two schemes if you remember. Otherwise, you write the just trend and pattern. Now, the most important thing here that you need to understand is second part. To what extent this has been in consonance with achieving the objective of inclusive growth. So, expenditure on social services and inclusive growth. You need to understand that how these are linked and to what extent it has helped in achieving inclusive growth. To what extent this has been in consonance with achieving the objective of inclusive growth. So, the first thing which should come to your mind is that just by spending on social services can we achieve inclusive growth? Because I have taught in the classes that for inclusive growth we require expenditure on infrastructure also. Of course, we require expenditure on health and education, but we also require expenditure on infrastructure building, road, railway, port, airport, because that creates jobs to a large section of our uneducated youth, unskilled job. So you have to link this expenditure trend with inclusive growth. So if you see 1991 to till 2024, around 33 years, we have increased the expenditure on social services, health and education, and various other social services, housing, tap water and all this. So to a certain extent, this has helped in achieving inclusive growth, to a certain extent. How we can say that it has helped in achieving inclusive growth? Because here you also need to give the data on poverty. So 1993-94, I have told this data in the class, 2004, 5, then 2011, 12. Here it was 36% poverty, 29% approx, and then 21.9%. So poverty has declined. Poverty has declined, and this is the absolute poverty. This is the decline in absolute poverty. So you can say that the government started trend. We have already written that government increased the expenditure on social services, and then you can relate with that this has helped in reducing poverty. This has helped in reducing poverty, and a lot of people were absorbed into the growth process. So it has helped, to a certain extent, it has helped in achieving inclusive growth. But inclusive growth, as I am saying you, it requires expenditure on social services plus expenditure on infrastructure also. Now the expenditure on infrastructure, we have not been able to do much in the last 30 years. It has mostly started in the last 7-8 years. So since we were not able to spend much on infrastructure, so that job creation aspect has not improved that much. Now it has started happening slowly. But if you will see from 1991 LPG reform period till let's say 2014-15, the expenditure on infrastructure was quite less. And always keep it in mind that inclusive growth is linked with expenditure on social services and expenditure on capital expenditure, which has the potential to create a lot of jobs. So we have not been able to create a lot of jobs because we did not spend in the last 30 years on infrastructure. But with the expenditure on health and education and other welfare schemes, we have been able to a certain extent, we have been able to push inclusive growth. But the real benefit of inclusive growth we have not achieved because of the lacking job scenario now which has started. So when this question is being asked that to what extent this has been in consonance with achieving the objective of inclusive growth, so you'll have to write that inclusive growth requires expenditure not only on social services, but it also requires an aggressive expenditure on infrastructure. Post 1991 period, we started increasing the expenditure on social services, but infrastructure was lacking. So to a certain extent, people income increased because of the expenditure on social services and they moved out of poverty. But inclusive growth will be possible at a larger extent only when there is a massive expenditure on infrastructure which can create a lot of jobs to our unskilled population. This has not happened in India on a major scale till now. So we have, to a certain extent, we have achieved inclusive growth, but we are still lacking a lot, and that I feel that now it may be possible with the recent last few years heavy expenditure on infrastructure, which will lead to job creation, and then we will see the real benefit of job creation leading to inclusive growth in India. So you'll have to link with this, and then you can write that expenditure on capital expenditure also. So how you can conclude this? So in conclusion, you can write that yes, it has helped. So expenditure on social services has helped in achieving inclusive growth to a certain extent, but the real potential will be achieved if government spends a lot on infrastructure, and the recent reforms on infrastructure like Gati Shakti, National Monetization Pipeline will definitely lead to inclusive growth in future. So in this way you can elaborate this. But the crux of this question is that inclusive growth is possible not only through social expenditure of social services, but it also requires expenditure on infrastructure. That is the crux, and we spend on social services whatever our resources was, but the expenditure on infrastructure was missing. So that's the reason that we have not seen enough job creation, and the inclusive growth objective has not been achieved. It has achieved only to a certain extent. Fine. Now let's move on to the next question. What are the causes of persistent high food inflation in India? Now this is a very current affairs question, and I have told this in class also, and posted on it on Telegram also, that in the last few months you have been seeing our inflation was higher for 5%, 5.5% last few months, 6-7 months basically. Inflation was over 5.2, 5.5, 6%. Headline inflation I am talking about. But the core inflation, excluding food and fuel, was around just 3.5%. So core inflation 3.5%. Headline inflation 5.5%. Why? Because food inflation was very high, 8%, 9%. So overall inflation, headline inflation was around 5.5%. Since last July, August, the inflation has come down, headline inflation has come down to 3.5%. But before July, that means till June, inflation was 5.5%, headline inflation, overall inflation was 5.5%. In that, food inflation was 9%, 8%, and core inflation was 3.5%. So food inflation has quite been higher. It has widely been discussed in the newspaper. And that same question has come here, that what are the causes of persistent high food inflation in India? Now, a simple question. The causes, this first part is quite simple, because everyone, they are reading in the newspaper. What are the causes of this persistent high food inflation? I have written it down. Climatic changes resulting in lesser yield, erratic rainfalls, climatic changes, erratic rainfalls, supply chain issues, lack of backward and forward linkages, lack of cold chain infrastructure, supply chain infrastructure. A lot of times regulated markets also create food inflation. So all these are the reasons. Heat wave during the Russia-Ukraine war, March 2020, the inflation increased a lot because of in that year because of the heat wave. So we are seeing recurrent floods, heat waves, climatic changes. These are recurrent phenomena, and there are certain structural problems like supply chain problem, lack of processing facilities, lack of cold storage facilities, lack of forward and backward linkages. All this results into persistent high inflation, and the last 1 year the food inflation was really high. One of the reason could be that our agriculture growth, which is generally 3.5%, the last year 2023-24 was just 1.5%. So food grain production has also not increased to that level. That is also one of the reasons of the high food inflation. So this is a simple part. Anyone can write, and this information is everywhere. Now the second part of this question is a good question, and it's tricky to answer. Comment on the effectiveness of the monetary policy of RBI to control this type of inflation. This type of inflation means food inflation. It's basically supply side, And this has widely been discussed in the newspaper also, that should we change the monetary policy goal because it includes food inflation, also the CPI inflation, CPI index, combined index that RBI is trying to tackle. It's basically includes food inflation also. So that's why this question is being asked, that food inflation is high, RBI is having difficulty in achieving the inflation target, but is RBI capable of controlling this food inflation? So that's why this question has been asked. It was widely discussed in the newspaper. So you have to comment on the effectiveness of the monetary policy of RBI to control this type of inflation. So do you think that RBI can control supply side inflation? So let us discuss this question, because a little bit technical. First, you will have to understand few things. So core inflation is, headline inflation includes everything. From headline, when we subtract food and fuel volatile components, it comes the core inflation. So core inflation was controlled 3.5%. Because of the higher food inflation, headline inflation was quite higher. Now the question is that, can RBI control this? So the answer is yes, to a certain extent RBI can control this. There are two reasons. First, listen carefully. First, see, if food inflation is high, and why your food inflation is high? Because of the supply side issues. That means connectivity, food growing regions to agricultural markets, connectivity issues, or lack of cold chain infrastructure. Now, can RBI resolve the connectivity or cold chain? No. Then how can RBI handle this supply side inflation? The answer to this question is that, see, there is certain level of demand, there is certain level of supply. Now supply is impacted, supply is less, demand was at a higher level, supply is less, that's why there is inflation. Now RBI cannot increase the supply, but RBI can reduce the demand. If supply has come down, if RBI can reduce the demand, then it can help in tackling inflation. So there is certain liquidity changing the output in the economy. If output produced is less, if RBI tightens the monetary condition, if RBI tightens the liquidity condition, the money supply with the people will be less, and that will help in reducing inflation. Because output is less, demand earlier was more. If RBI will tighten the liquidity, demand will come down. Generally, demand of discretionary items comes down, but even for basic items, to a certain extent, not exactly, but to a certain extent, when the overall liquidity is tight, the demand for overall goods and services comes down. So demand can be reduced, supply cannot be changed, but since supply is less, and that's why there was inflation, so RBI's monetary tightening can lead to reduction in demand. This can help in tackling inflation. It cannot control this properly, but to a certain extent, yes, it can help in controlling inflation. The second reason is that, see what happens. Now there was a discussion that should RBI, the target which has been given to RBI is CPI combined. It includes food. Should food be excluded or should it remain there? So the answer to this question, yes, it should remain there, because most of the people in India feel inflation. Majority of the people in India feel inflation through food prices, because there is a major expenditure, around 46% expenditure is on food items in CPI, 46% weightage is on food items. So of course there are other components also, but majority of what I am trying to say is majority of the people feel inflation through food prices, because there is major expenditure is on food items. So when, let's say, whatever they consume, rice, wheat, potato, pulses, tomato, if these prices starts increasing, they feel inflation a lot. Even though the other prices are increasing or not increasing, that doesn't matter much, but whatever are the daily consumable items, if these prices starts increasing, most of the people feel inflation through these items. Now if the prices of these items are high, then they start expecting that the inflation is higher, and this inflation expectation gets inbuilt in their psychology, in their mind, and they start expecting that our wages should increase. Since inflation is high, our wages should increase. Now this thinking of theirs, that their wages should increase, this ultimately results in higher wages and higher inflation in future. So higher food inflation in the present date may lead to higher expectation of wages, and higher expectation of wages may ultimately result in higher inflation in future. So removing this, and if this food item is removed, then it will not help RBI in tackling food inflation. So food inflation must be controlled, because majority of the people feel inflation through food prices. If food prices are not controlled, it will actually result in higher inflation in future years, then which will become very difficult for RBI to handle. So the target which has been given to RBI for tackling food inflation, for tackling overall inflation, which includes food, it should be there, because if it is removed, then it will impact the overall inflation also. Try to understand that the overall inflation gets impacted through food inflation. If food inflation is high, you will expect that your wages should increase more, and then the whole inflation starts increasing. So we cannot remove this food inflation. This is the logic that it should be there. That has not been asked here, but you can just explain this in 2-3 lines. That comment on the effectiveness. So आप यहाँ लिखोगे that RBI, to a certain extent, RBI can control food inflation by reducing the demand, not by increasing the supply. And food inflation should be there in the RBI's target, because food inflation leads to the increase in overall inflation, and RBI must control this overall inflation, right? And then to conclude this question, I went more into the deep into explaining this. No need to go for all this. So in conclusion, you can write that in the last few months, food inflation has come down. In the last few months, food inflation has come down, and because of that, the overall CPI combined target has come down to around 3.5%. So you should also tell the data if you are aware. Fine. Let's next move to the next question. Discuss the merits and demerits of the 4 labor codes. Discussed in detail in class 4 labor codes in the context of labor market reforms in India. The background is that most of the labor laws that were enacted in India, they were enacted in the post-independence period, 1940s, 50s. For example, Industrial Disputes Act 1947, then Minimum Wages Act 1948, Factories Act 1948 around. So this is asking about the 4 labor codes. So 250 words question hai. So you can give a little bit background, how you can start this intro. Most of the labor laws in India were enacted during the independence time in the socialist, and they were more suited to the socialist regime. The previous labor laws more suited to the socialist regime. In 1991, Government of India implemented economic reforms, but we didn't touch labor laws. So even today, the economy has been liberalized, but our labor laws are still more suited to the socialist regime. So we must reform the labor laws, right? Now the 4 labor codes, you should write, at least you should remember the name, the Code on Wages 2019, then Occupational Safety and Health, Occupational Safety, Health and Working Conditions Code 2020, then Social Security Code 2020, Industrial Code 2020. 3 codes of 2020 and 1 code, the Code on Wages, is of 2019. So you have to discuss the merits and demerits. Now this is all purely information based. If you know, then you can write. So what has happened in these codes, just let me briefly explain. So there are 4 labor codes. You have to write the merits from these 4 labor codes and demerits. So some important merits are, in the previous Minimum Wages Act 1948, minimum wages were not applicable on all class of workers. But here in the new code on wages, minimum wages has been made applicable on all formal and informal workers. And earlier in the Minimum Wages Act 1948, the way minimum wages used to be decided was quite complicated. Now it has been made very simplified. Now the minimum wages will be based just on geography and skills. So universalization of minimum wages, simplification of minimum wage. Earlier it was based on different types of job codes. Now it is based just on geography and skills. Universalization of social security. The code on social security says that government must create a social security fund for all workers, especially for informal workers. So the new code ensures social security for all workers in India, whereas the previous code was applicable only for formal workers, right? Then flexibility to industries in doing business and hiring and firing. In earlier labor codes, it has asked the merits and demerits. So when you are writing the merits of the 4 labor codes, briefly if you can write what was the issue in the previous code. Because if you are writing merits, so you must give a contrast that this was the issue in the previous labor laws. So here in the new labor code, till 300 workers, industries are allowed to hire and fire. And this 300 number can be increased just by notification. You don't require an amendment in the law. Earlier, hiring and firing was allowed only till 100 workers. So all the industries which had fluctuating demand, for example, textile mills. Now, when they get order, they want to produce more. When there are no orders, they want to keep the number of laborers minimum. Now, that industry requires hiring and firing. We are not allowing. And the result is that Bangladesh or Vietnam are exporting more than us. So this labor codes gives flexibility in hiring and firing. Industrial Relations Code 2020. Then make industrial strikes difficult while promoting hiring and firing. Make industrial strikes difficult. Earlier labor codes said that only 10% of the laborers who are on payroll, if they are willing, they can form a trade union. But now at least 51% of the labor on the payroll, if they agree, then only they can form a trade union and they will have the bargaining power with the management regarding the salary or wages. So now only if 51% of the overall labor are willing, then only they can form a labor union and they can negotiate the fee or wages with the management. Earlier it was allowed only till 10% level. So industrial strikes have become very difficult. So it's a merit in the sense that it will give flexibility, it will give more freedom for businessmen to do business. It reduces influence of trade unions, the same thing is there. Then industrial strikes is related to basically this trade unions. Reduction of cost and complexity in compliance. Now there is ease of doing business. In the labor laws, these earlier government, central government, these labor laws falls under concurrent subject. So central government had 44 labor laws, every state government had few labor laws. So overall in India, we had more than 200 labor laws. Now it is all going to be central has clubbed its 44 labor laws in 4 labor laws. So it is more simplified. Complying with 44 labor laws and now complying with 4 labor laws. Of course, it will be more simplified and it will be cost effective. Formalization of jobs and skilling. This new labor codes allows fixed employment. This new labor codes has given definition for gig and platform workers. So it has created definition for all those workers, not permanent employees, fixed term employees, contract workers, and then gig workers. Gig workers can be platform or non-platform. It has given the definition for all these. So it will help in creating formal jobs. For example, earlier, if a person was driving Ola cab, there was no definition for that kind of labor. No social security scheme was applicable. But now they come under formal jobs because there exists extended definition for that in the new labor codes. So these are the various benefits of the new labor codes. Few demerits are that bargaining power of the laborers has been reduced. Why? Because earlier only 10% were sufficient to form a union. Now it's 51%. Job security issues because hiring and firing is allowed. Earlier, if a company has to fire, then they need to apply to the government and government was not giving approvals. But now till 300 laborers, they can easily hire and fire. And one very important clause that you need to write is that Occupational Safety, Health and Working Conditions Code 2020, it says that if state government wants, it can exempt few or all the clauses of this code for promoting more employment. Now, if the state government exempts, then a lot of clauses related to health, safety, they may get compromised and people may be dragged to do excessive work, overtime work without proper compensation. And so basically, just let me give you one example. The Occupational Safety, Health and Working Conditions Code, it says that women are allowed in all types of establishment, all types of jobs, and even in night shift also, but it is the responsibility of the employer to provide security. But the code also says that state government can exempt any industry from all these clauses. Now, to promote industrialization, if a state government exempts this, then the employee will not have that responsibility. So it can it can have negative consequences also. Now, the second part of this question asks this, that what has been the progress so far in this regard? So the progress is only that these 4 codes were passed during COVID 2020. One code, the code on wages, was passed in 2019. Yes, 1920, and rest were passed in 2021. Already passed in the parliament. On top of codes, the state government, they are framing rules and regulations on top of those 4 labor codes. Because every act, see, the act has major provisions, but how it will be exactly implemented, it has rules on top of those codes. So governments are framing rules and regulations. Once it comes into picture, then these labor codes will become effective in the economy. But till now, we are still having previous labor laws, and government is framing rules and regulations with the help of the state governments. So this is the status, progress. When they are asking what has been the progress so far in this regard, so you can write from the previous that it took so many years for discussion and passing of the laws. Ultimately, it has been passed during the COVID, and now governments are framing rules and regulations for its effective implementation. Then the next question, what is the need for expanding the regional air connectivity in India? In this context, discuss the government's UDAN scheme and its achievements. In this context, discuss the government's UDAN scheme. So if you understand the UDAN scheme, then only you can answer the first part. What is the need for expanding the regional air connectivity? So let me just explain you that what was the UDAN scheme, and then you can think of that how it can expand in regional connectivity. See, what happens in India is that earlier this scheme was launched in 2016. So in India, there was very few airlines connecting tier 2, tier 3 cities. So what used to happen in tier 2, tier 3 cities was that economies were not developed, per capita income was less. So when per capita income in the tier 2, tier 3 towns were less, few people were flying through airlines. Now when few people were flying through airlines, the airlines were charging more because their cost will be more. If the flights are not fully loaded, if only 30%, 20% capacity is being utilized, then the fare will be high. So when the fare will be high, few people will fly. Listen carefully. Tier 2, tier 3 towns per capita income was less. Since the income was less, few people were flying. And since few people were flying, the fare was high. And since fare was high, few people were flying. So it was a kind of deadlock situation. And that's why our tier 2, tier 3 towns, regional areas were not able to expand the services of airlines. Now to tackle this situation, government launched this UDAN scheme. So what we have done in UDAN scheme, government has put a cap that any airline can charge only rupees 2,500 between 2 cities of distance of 500. Now government put a cap, and then government said that if it is not viable, we will give you subsidy. Viability gap fund. So the first part, that what is the need for expanding the regional air connectivity? What is the need for expanding the regional air connectivity in India is that those economies, those areas were not developing, because let's say northeast, hilly states, to a certain extent we have road and railway connectivity, but these areas, it is much easier to connect them through flights and airports, because only then these economies will expand. So need for expanding the regional air connectivity is that a lot of times it becomes difficult. Train cannot pass to all these regions, hilly states. So air connectivity, if we connect them through air, these areas can be very easily connected with the mainland, and then it helps a boost in the economies of those areas. So this was the main reason, and this was done through the UDAN scheme. So UDAN scheme, government auctioned. UDAN scheme is also called regional connectivity scheme. So it auctioned the airline routes to the airlines. So airlines had to bid, and then only one airline will fly between these two points, two nodes. So what is the need for expanding the regional air connectivity in India? So you will write that to promote inclusive growth, airports and airlines has higher multiplier effect, and then connecting the regional areas with road and railway sometimes becomes difficult. So due to the terrain like northeast and hilly states, so it will help in boosting the economy, because till now these areas have been cut off from the main areas and we have not been able to see better growth, economic growth in these areas. So connecting through flights will be easier, and it will help in achieving economic growth and inclusive growth. In this context, discuss the government's UDAN scheme. So UDAN scheme you will have to elaborate, and its achievements. Now, what is the achievement of UDAN scheme? Earlier in these routes where UDAN scheme has been launched, there was 30% capacity utilization of flights. Now that 30% has increased to 80 to 85%. So most of the times flights are running at 80 to 85% capacity utilization. This is the most important benefit that we have seen. So achievements, 80 to 85% capacity utilization. Acha, one more thing, in UDAN scheme earlier we launched airlines. Now we have launched helicopters also and seaplanes. Seaplanes means, let's say ki, we have Mumbai, and let's say there is a place Bangalore, or there is a place in Kerala. So we will be using the sea surface for flying airlines. So seaplanes, they will take off from the sea. So we have also started helicopters and seaplanes in this UDAN scheme. So achievements are 80 to 85% capacity utilization, then accessible air travel for all. How accessible air travel for all? Because we have capped the 50% of the seats have been capped at 2,500 rupees. Then it will promote tourism, boost trade. This government has a lot of focus on tourism. Through tourism, economies get a boost, economic growth happens. So promoting tourism, boosting trade, and empowering local economies. Just for example, from Mundra, Gujarat to Teju in Arunachal Pradesh to Hubli in Karnataka, RCS is connecting 30 states. It has now connected 30 states across the length and breadth of the country. A total of 75 airports have been operationalized under UDAN scheme. So in UDAN scheme, we are developing the total plan is to develop 450 airports, no frill airports, means very low cost airports at a cost of around 100 crores. So we are going to develop around 450 airports, no frill airports at a cost of around rupees 100 crore, and then all these will be connected with flights. And earlier there was a limit ki UDAN scheme was applicable for those routes at a distance of 500 kilometers, but now that has been relaxed. This question was that discuss the government's UDAN scheme and its achievements. So achievements, these are the achievements, and then just for an example you can write these. And the one thing as a keyword you should write that flights and airports, they also have a very high multiplier effect which helps in expanding GDP fast. Fine. Now let's move on to the next question. What were the factors responsible for the successful implementation of land reforms in some parts of the country? Elaborate. So first you need to write a brief introduction. What intro you can write? Post-independence, more than 75% of the population was dependent on agriculture, and more than 50% GDP was coming from agriculture, and agriculture was dependent on land. And the land ownership was very skewed in India, few people owning majority of the land. So this was the context in which land reforms were introduced. And since land was a concurrent subject, so central government recommended states to implement reforms. Fine. So you can just name few reforms: abolition of Jamindari, tenancy reforms, land ceiling and distribution, land consolidation. Now it is asking that what were the factors responsible for the successful implementation of land reforms. So what were the factors responsible? Political will. Then one of the most important factor which led to the success of abolition of Jamindari reform is that, see, used to be seen as the coming from this British camp. So Jamindars, they have exploited a lot of peasants and tenants. So when government introduced Jamindari, abolition of Jamindari, Jamindars didn't get the mass support. The Jamindars didn't get the mass support because the people used to feel, the peasants and these people who used to actually cultivate, they used to feel this, that the zamindars belonged to the camp of Britishers and they exploited these people. So when government introduced the reforms and zamindars wanted to get the support of the masses, they didn't give any support. So because, and our constitutional amendment was also done, first and fourth, which made the demand of these zamindars non-justiciable. So these two are the most important factor in making this abolition of zamindari a great success. Tenancy reforms and land ceiling was not that successful as compared to the zamindari reforms. So what were the factors responsible for successful implementation of land reforms? Political will and strong leadership, mass movements and social pressure. Like for example, in Telangana, there was an immense pressure for land reforms resulting in large scale distribution in the following decades. Then legal framework, as I suggested that we did constitutional amendment to make the demands of these zamindars non-justiciable. Constitutional amendment were made to support abolition of zamindari. Cooperative movements, like in Gujarat, there were cooperative movements which also led to the successful implementation of the reforms in those areas. And agricultural backwardness, as I said that majority of the people who used to cultivate, peasants, they didn't have land. So there was a political pressure there on the government also that these reforms must be done. So these were the reasons for the successful implementation of the reforms. Achha. Then how these reforms impacted? Because of the land reforms, around 2 crore people got the ownership right all across India. And in conclusion, you can link it with the present land reforms that in 2016, now central government has forwarded the agricultural land leasing law to the states to implement in their states. So this is the present reform which central government on the recommendation of the Niti Aayog has forwarded to the states to implement these reforms. Then next question, elucidate the importance of buffer stocks for stabilizing agricultural prices in India. A simple question. Elucidate the importance of buffer stocks. So to start with, in the introduction, you can say that you can explain, write a little bit about the PDS. We started the distribution of food grains under public distribution in India started since the Bengal famine in Second World War, and then it continued at a larger scale post the Green Revolution. And from 1997, the targeted PDS started. Then you can come to that government through FCI stores buffer stock. What for? 3 important purposes. One is public distribution. So from the buffer stock, public distribution system is done. Then buffer stock, what other activities are done? In case of bad agricultural years, when the procurement from farmers doesn't happen, then from this buffer stock, see 3 purposes. From the buffer stock, FCI distributes food grains. Second, if there is a bad agricultural year and procurement doesn't happen, then again from this stock, FCI sells the food grains in the wholesale market, which is called open market sale scheme. And third, if the procurement doesn't happen, in case of bad agricultural year, this is used for the distribution of food grains under PDS distribution also. So illustrate the importance of buffer stocks for stabilizing agricultural prices in India. These 2-3 points you write, and then a recent, this government is doing since last 50-60 years. But recently what has happened? Government has launched a new scheme, price stabilize, and see, first thing is this FCI keeps buffer stock of rice and wheat around 25 million ton. This question is about general buffer stock. It is not asking just about the FCI's buffer stock. So FCI buffer stocks that I just explained you. But what has happened in 2014 when this India government came? At that time the prices of pulses were very high. So government launched another scheme, price stabilization fund. So government allocated certain fund, and through that what will be done? Government agencies like NAFED will procure from the farmers. Some other agency, not FCI, NAFED will procure from the farmers during the harvesting season those crops which are volatile like pulses, potato, onion, and they will store. They will store, and if there is price spike in future, then from this stock, these these food items will be released in the market at a regulated price. For example, 2 years back when onion prices moved across 100, NAFED distributed the onions to Safal and other agencies, retail agencies, and then they sold these items at a regulated price around 29-30 rupees. So that's also a buffer stock. It's not only about the FCIs. So this has helped. And recently, last year, even this year only, before the elections, government started distributing Bharat Atta, Bharat Rice, Bharat Pulses from its buffer stock. So government started releasing the stock to the retail people, branded as Bharat Atta, Bharat Rice, Bharat Pulses from this buffer stock. Fine. So it has helped a lot in controlling prices. Second part, what are the challenges associated with the storage of buffer stock? What are the challenges associated with the storage of buffer stock? So the challenges are, see, the buffer stock that FCI stores, it has only 50% of the storage capacity whatever it procures. A lot of food grains are stored in the method it is called cover and plinth. It keeps the stock in open, it creates a platform, keeps it in the open, and then it covers with a polythene. Lot of wastage. So what are the challenges in storage? Lack of storage capacity, food gets wasted, quality gets degraded. The FCI's buffer stock costing is almost double as compared to the private market. As compared to the private market, it is double the cost. So lack of storage capacity, higher cost of storage, wastage of stocks, deterioration of quality. And the third thing is, when the buffer stock, see, there are certain norms that government needs to keep 25 million ton of buffer stock, wheat and rice. So when the buffer stock increases beyond that limit, FCI is not allowed to sell it immediately. FCI needs to take permission, and that permission generally is not given or given so late that FCI is not able to sell it. So this is also a challenge in the storage, because storage go down is full and you cannot liquidate that item. So what now, in conclusion, you should write something new, whatever is happening is present, for example, current thing. So as I said, only FCI has only 50% of the capacity to store properly whatever it procures. So last year, government has started an aggressive storage program. Ministry of Cooperation, Government of India has started an aggressive storage building program through Primary Agricultural Credit Societies, PACS. So PACS is going to build huge godowns for storage of buffer stocks. So government is planning to expand the storage capacity for food grains through Primary Agricultural Credit Societies. I hope that you understand this PACS. They are the structure under rural cooperative, long-term, rural cooperative, short-term lending, state cooperative banks, district central cooperative banks, and then PACS. They are outside the purview of RBI. So through PACS, they basically work at the village level. So through at the PACS level, government is going to build aggressively this food storage capacity. Fine. Then moving to the next question. What are the challenges faced by Indian irrigation system in recent times? State the measures taken by the government for efficient irrigation management. See, what are the major challenges faced by Indian irrigation system in recent times? So you can just write a brief introduction about irrigation. What you need to tell here is, see, they are asking that what are the challenges faced by the Indian irrigation system. See, there are two things. One is Sources of irrigation. Sources of irrigation, we have canals, tube wells, wells, tanks. And then how we apply these sources, the water coming from these sources, to the fields. So sources of irrigation and system of irrigation. Sources of irrigation and then application of this water into the fields. Types of irrigation. Now types of irrigation, we have flood irrigation. We have micro irrigation, under micro irrigation, we have drip irrigation, sprinkler irrigation. So briefly you can write it that. And the majority source of irrigation in India is now tube wells. Earlier it was canals. So what are the major challenges faced by the Indian irrigation system? So the way we irrigate, there are major challenges. What are the challenges? You can see inefficient water usage. Utilization is just 35 to 40% because mostly in wheat and rice we use flood irrigation. There is huge wastage of water. Over exploitation of groundwater, as you know that Punjab and Haryana, we are, because of the rice wheat cropping pattern, we are extracting huge amount of water from the underground and water table is going down every year around 2 to 3 feet. Changing rainfall patterns. Now since last few years we are seeing that monsoon is getting delayed. So the monsoon which earlier used to start from mid-June, it's getting delayed from July and then it continues for late. For example, even this year it has continued for late. Then changing rainfall, water pollution, 70% of India's water resources are contaminated. A lot of urban waste is being dumped. Water logging and salinization, poor drainage systems cause water logging and soil salinity, reducing agricultural productivity. Then impact of climate change. See, erratic rainfall leads to the level of water in the reservoir that also gets impacted because of the erratic rainfall, and water availability. Because of the erratic rainfalls, the level of water in the rivers is also impacted, and that also impacts our irrigation, the way we irrigate the fields. Interstate water disputes, for example, Kaveri water dispute between Karnataka and Tamil Nadu. Because of the disputes, one state suffers because they don't get access to the water for the irrigation purpose. Lack of modernization. In India, only 15% of the irrigated, the potential of irrigation is through drip irrigation. So these are the challenges in irrigation. This is our general, you can anyway write on your own. Measures taken by the government. So when we are saying measures taken by the government, mostly you have to write the schemes. Pradhan Mantri Krishi Sinchai Yojana, Jal Shakti Abhiyan, micro irrigation schemes you can write. National Water Mission, Command Area. So these are government programs you can anyway write. So it's all about how much programs of the government you have marked it up. A robust and efficient irrigation system is crucial for India's food security. No issues. Next and last question is, explain the role of millets for ensuring health and nutritional security in India. So last year we celebrated the Millets year 2023. Now the question has been asked this year that explain the role of millets for ensuring health and nutritional security in India. So millets are coarse grains and a repository of protein, fiber, vitamins. You see in introduction you need to write what are the various millets in India, and you can write that India is the largest producer of millets in the world. It accounts for 20% global production and 80% Asia's production. Millets has the potential to ensure health and nutritional security in India. Now it's more technical rather than economic. So you have to link that whatever are the proteins, vitamins, fibers that are found in the millets, with that you have to link it with nutritional security, and with that you have to link it with health security. Now if you remember if you know the points, you will be able to write. Otherwise, just writing generic points may not help you. So you have to link with, for example, millets are packed with essential vitamins and minerals like calcium, iron, zinc and vitamins that contribute to overall health. For example, ragi, finger millet is rich in calcium. So you have to see there are 5-6 millets that we have discussed. Jowar, ragi, kora, RK, sama, bajra. So all these are rich in nutrients, minerals, vitamins. You have to link it with nutritional security. If you remember the nutrients in which millets it's found, it's the best because you can give example. Otherwise, you will find it difficult to write this kind of answer. And one more point you can write, that to ensure nutritional security, government has made a provision that millets needs to be distributed under the National Food Security Act for both priority households and that AAY Yojana. And in conclusion, you can write millets are climate smart crops, and millets are climate smart crops and are more resilient in the changing climatic situation and are drought tolerant, which has the potential to ensure health and nutritional security. So a simple question, it's all about whether you remember those points or not. So that's all. So most of the questions were quite simple, general, but all these must be supported with data and facts. So it was more of how you are going to present it. The first question, the trend pattern, that was and regarding that RBI inflation was a little bit difficult to write, but otherwise most of the questions were simple. So that's all from my side. Thank you.